All right, thank you all for joining us. We're going to get started here in just a moment. Just a quick note that pizza will be served at the end of the event today.
All right, hello everybody. Welcome to today's Hinckley Forum. My name is Max Lepore and I will be the forum host today. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley Forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is titled State, Religion, and Politics in India, Shifts and Challenges in the 21st Century. First, a quick introduction to our conversation today. Unity in diversity has been the core principle of the idea of India both historically and especially since the country's independence. However, contemporary debates and dilemmas in India's politics have led to rethinking and remaking of the idea. The lecture will elucidate the identity dilemma through an examination of the core principles of democracy, development, and social justice as they relate to today's India. We are excited to be joined for this conversation by Professor Ramu Manivannan, Fulbright Visiting Professor at the Joseph Corbel School of International Studies, University of Denver. Today's conversation will also be moderated by Dean Chatterjee, former faculty member of the S.J. Quinney College of Law. I will now turn it over to him to formally introduce Professor Manivannan.
Okay, great. Thanks, Max. I will quickly introduce Professor Manivannan, our distinguished speaker, and then, of course, he will get started. Now, by the way, like him, I was also born in India, though I look Swedish, but people often don't know that. I was born in India. So just wanted to make clear of that. So Professor Manivannan, he, as Max introduced him, he is a Fulbright visiting professor at the Joseph Corbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. He is the author of 7 path-breaking books and many influential articles, and he has been a professor of politics and public administration at the University of Madras and Delhi in India. He has been a visiting professor and a fellow, distinguished fellow, at prominent universities in Germany, France, Sweden, Taiwan, and Japan. His research and work focuses on education and politics, with an emphasis on peace, democracy, and social justice. He is an unique scholar in the sense that he not only is a very prominent scholar, internationally known, but also he is an activist. He's an activist, political and social, and he has been focused on building inclusive communities, especially bringing in marginalized folks, people like migrants and others, poor folks, and tribal folks, and especially poor children. He has founded 15 non-formal schools for poor children, and his monumental school that he has founded, that he is working on now, is called the Garden of Peace. So in that sense, he combines both these two sides, both theory and practice. What he preaches, that also he practices too. That's an unique qualification. He's very unique in that sense. And the topic, as Max mentioned, the topic of his talk today is State, Religion, and Politics in India, Shifts and Challenges in the 21st Century. India has been in the news on so many fronts, and so it's quite a timely topic. So that's what Professor Manivannan is going to talk now, and so I turn it over now to you. And by the way, so Professor Manivandan is going to speak for about half an hour to 35 minutes, leaving about roughly 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. And we'll start with the students when it comes to questions before we get to other folks. And also it's now online too, so there might be questions from online audience as well. Thank you for coming here. Professor Manivandan.
Thank you, Professor Dean Chatterjee, and distinguished scholars and professors and dear students, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm very deeply honored and very happy to be here and sharing this conversation with you about state, religion, and democracy in India. And also the time that we are talking about, this question of state, politics, and religion is very important for India and for the world as well, actually, because what happens in one country, it happens in all parts of the world. So there's a kind of a connection that we all share and talk about the idea of democracy itself. So what it means about, for me, the idea of India is that the philosophical, spiritual, and the cultural notion of India is that we keep searching for meaning at one side. On another side is that it is a civilizational, the concept, the idea of a civilizational notion of India. That's the first thing that comes in my mind. And the long years, hundreds and hundreds of years, this idea of India had existed. And it has not just come in by what commonly perceived and being talked about as like reference to a pre-colonial period. There's the conquest of India, then the colonization, and subsequent is the a resistance, a freedom struggle, and a post-independent India. This is a very short narrative of India itself. But I think India has a much longer history, the idea and the imagination of India itself. And that is how the cultural notion, the cultural roots of India is also perceived, and everyday life of India is based on that perception of a very historical, cultural, and civilizational notion of India is that. So what is this idea of a civilizational, cultural, historical notion is founded is that it is founded on a very philosophy of a multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, and the idea, the concept of the plural basis of our existence. The plurality is the very inherent notion of our existence. And this is the concept that we have about what I perceive as the notion of being Indian and what India means to me. Then how this notion as when in the pre-colonial existence is that there is a kind of a very interesting argument about like often it is stated in the Western literature, even in India that we talk about it. And the notion is that it is the administrative unity of India that has been brought in by the colonial enterprise, and then India became one after colonization. But I think that so we are talking about that kind of an administrative knitting together of the unit of idea of India from an administrative point of view is that. But the idea of a cultural and a civilizational notion of India precedes that administrative notion. You cannot come suddenly, in a 200 years of enterprise and a colonization, and administratively you bring together the various provinces and then run a country. It cannot happen even in 100 years' time. So there has to be a certain kind of a cultural and a civilizational thing. So this cultural and civilizational notion is that it has a kind of a cultural practices with or without the notion of a religion, organized religion. Because even this idea of a religion is that in a form, it has absolutely a diverse practices throughout the country, from the north to the southern part of the country and to the eastern, to the western part of the country. And like various practices pre-existed. So at the time of the partition, or what we call as the independence of India, is that like we carried this, the whole united India was the common vision even by 1940s something. And we did not, the national leadership did not anticipate, did not foresee. And, but we had contradictions, we had conflicts and creative conflicts and politics of demand and mobilization. All these were happening during the last phase of the anti-colonial struggle or the freedom movement itself. But when India became free, we were partitioned, the partition of India. So this is where, like, a major shift happens in the construction of the idea and the imagination of India, is that India is divided at the time. India divided is that it's a physically, geographically, and India was divided. At the same time, like the idea of India still retained philosophically, politically, spiritually, and culturally by the same leadership. This is something very unique about the transition that happened in 1947. So there was a wound, what you call the civilizational wound, happened by the partition of India in 1947. But in all cultures, in civilizations, such transitions occur. But what we learn from that, what we retain, is the most important aspect. I think the leadership at that time, led by Mahatma Gandhi and Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, who led the freedom struggle, and then like followed by leaders like then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, and then various other leaders, Maulana Abdul Kalam Azad, very many leaders, and the quiet and the philosophical foundations of the cultural foundations written by people like Rabindranath Tagore and many others. So we had this kind of philosophical, political, cultural, civilizational ethos, well-retained, well-founded by 1947. And then this is the idea that helped us to shape India from 1947 and then on to what you witnessed in the later 20, 30 years' time. But something happened. Something happened by the mid-80s in India. And there was a generational change in the leadership. Generational change in the leadership from the Gandhi, Nehru, and the first generation of leaders who witnessed the freedom struggle to the post-independent generation comes in power. So there is a kind of a technocratic understanding of politics emerges in Indian politics and society. And at the same time, this country also carries certain ramifications or implications of the wound that India was partitioned on the basis of two-nation theory. So this particular thing keeps coming back as a conversational political divide within the larger Indian polity thing. And why this particular factor of religion keeps coming back and forth in the Indian politics and the Indian society is that there are many other demands of politics of articulation, like, for example, about social change and social transformation, and then about what you called as the social radicalization, and the idea of a social empowerment, and more emphatically, the politics of social justice. So the politics of social justice is a very, very important aspect about it assumes the centrality to this conversation. What happens when you talk about social justice? And how does this contradictions bring forth? When you are talking about social justice is that we are intrinsically going into questioning what you call either intra-religious authority and order in a system. So when you're talking about larger, greater democratization, when you're talking about social empowerment, when you're talking about broadening the basis of democracy, is that the traditional power structures which has traditionally held the control of the politics and society for a long many years and in the post-independent transition too, they continue to retain power, but the basis of the power shift is taking place. And that vision was there in drafting of the Constitution itself. In drafting of the Constitution, in a broader understanding of what kind of the India, free India that we wanted. And in drafting the Constitution, despite all the social authority and control, what you call is traditional power structures in the Hindu caste and community, but the drafting of the Constitution was led by a man called Dr. Ambedkar. Dr. Ambedkar, and is not only was the chairman of the drafting committee, but he had brought in very critical insights in the debate of the Constitution itself. So here I want to mention about the context of relevance in the time of independence and in the post-independence period. At the time of independence, there is a very interesting reference. I want to make this reference to this 1947, when India was free, the midnight of the 1947 and August 15th, and Gandhi, who led the freedom struggle, was not in the capital of the city. He was elsewhere in Navkali walking a peace march, bringing about a reconciliation and conflict resolution there. And the Prime Minister of India was kind of unfurling the national flag at that time. And the man who led the freedom struggle, he was walking on a peace march elsewhere. So his mission was different. So there is in society and politics also, there is a kind of a constant social dialogue happening. And the vision of India was very well kept at that time. And by 1980s, this kind of broadening the social basis, expanding this, the social justice dialogue in the country creates certain kind of responses in political conflict. One of such response was the restoring or the reviving of the religious as an important political card. And I want us to go back and calling in by 1989. 1989 also indicated in India, it's the end of the single party dominance. In the Congress party dominance, the end of the single party system had come to an end. And by India was going into a kind of a multi-party system or a coalitional politics and a period of instability. And but I don't, personally, if you ask me about is multi-party system or a coalition politics is a kind of instability, I would say that in politics it finds its way. It's a kind of a very turbulent time. So turbulence is a part of our socio-political spaces. So we have to, in the earth science and geology, there is always an activity in the earth, what we call seismic activity. When it explodes, you call it as a kind of an earthquake. But in politics too, there is a constant movement, continuous. Politics never rests. I always tell people that politics is one action that it has no beginning, it cannot end. It doesn't end at all. So in that sense of the word, when the social justice dialogue gets expanded, and Ambedkar acquires a very significant space in Indian politics, and in broadening the basis of what you call as the social basis and the political empowerment in states in northern India, particularly in states like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, you find about even the chief minister of the state, Mayawati by name, she, a lady from the marginalized community, becomes the chief minister of the province. So there is a certain kind of new definitions in politics very prominently coming together. And then the social justice and the politics of positive affirmation arises to the fore by the 1990s. And when we look at that particular time, simultaneously the politics of what you call the radical right-wing politics takes its kind of a very concrete direction. And as is a kind of you call it as a dialogue, as a kind of a response, or you call it as a reaction. But this is something, it's a simmering conflict which has existed, and right from independence, right from pre-independence period. And this is a dialogue within the society, culture, religion. So this has always existed, simmering concepts that kind of brings back to the fore by the 1990s, and then on to the next 20 years, next 10 years, you find about coming into the consolidation of this perspective. It doesn't become dominant even then. But when does it become dominant? I want to share this view, very sympathetically, I want to share this view. In right wing, what we call as a radicalism, or the Hindu fundamentalism, and it has not just acquired acceptability because it is right-wing radicalism or Hindu fundamentalism. There are certain fault lines in the normal governing process, like the corruption, like the excesses in power, and the abuse of power system, and excesses in kind of authoritarianism. Sometimes it's a government is a liberal government, a liberal democratic government, but what happens inside the institutions, the structures, and it doesn't come into the public view, but institutions change. There is a kind of an institutional dynamism which is reversing that process inside the country. So that has happened in India from the late 70s until the 1990s. So these institutional decline, and then the corruption in the Congress party during the time, say by the 1990s and to the transition, so people are looking for alternative. And here, people at times are not thinking about should we be ruled by a party which is talking about Hindu fundamentalism, or the revival of Hinduism, or the Hindutva nation state, or should we be concerned about basic needs? So this is a kind of a global phenomenon. This is not something that happens only in India. It can happen in any country, in any part of the world. When people's basic needs and democratic rights and decline in institutional values and decline in institutional performance, so these alterations or these setbacks also result in kind of a rapid upward movement of radical right-wing politics. This has also happened in Indian politics at this time, during this time. Then we were also witnessed by the beginning of the 21st century, or the first two decades, the first decade of the 21st century, is that there is very clearly, there is a politics of mobilization, methods of mobilizations. We have been talking about mobilizing people and then basis in politics in terms of justice, the justice in terms of social justice, about distributional issues, and many things have happened. In India is, when we say India a plural in a sense, also it is a classically a federal country. A federal country in a sense is not only by a structure, but in terms of languages. And we in India, we have recognized by the schedule, by the 8th schedule of the Constitution, we have 22 languages acknowledged, and in practice of people, no less than about 7 million, 8 million people even speaking about of every language that of the 22 languages that we're mentioning about. Then this country is divided into about 29 states. 29 states, and then 8 union territories. So people speak many languages, and all these languages have a place. So there is always, I don't say dualism, there is a kind of a multiplicity of politics and space. There's a multiplicity of politics and public political discourses happening. So something that is happening in the northern part of the country is not exactly the same thing happening in the east. And something is happening in the east, but we are all following what is happening here and there. So that some important developments, the two important significant developments in the what you call in the beginning of the 2005 and 6 is that we witness there is a demolition of a place of worship happens. This is one particular thing. And another thing that happens at that particular time is that communalizing the political agenda. Communalizing the political agenda is that, how does it happen is that the politics of deprivation. So when we so long have been talking about politics of empowerment and politics of reservations and politics of social justice for about 50 years, and right from 1947 until about the last decade of the 20th century, we're talking about politics of distributional justice, and because we needed empowerment, the federal issues, language rights, and the country went through very strong currents of demonstration of language rights, a demonstration of social justice. And by now, the responses has to come within the system. And this within the system is that, there is a kind of what the right-wing radicalism takes for the line is that there has been a politics of appeasement. There's been a politics of appeasement. Then there has been a denial and deprivation of the rights of the Hindu majoritarianism. What they called is that majoritarian secularism. And this whole idea of a secularism also needs to be defined. In India, it doesn't have Indian constitution. When I say Indian constitution, is that the leaders of the national movement in 1947, and then people, and if leaders have to speak something about the constitution, but people must have faith in it. People must have had a history of that kind of practices. Only then it can become part of the constitution. The idea of Indian secularism is that it's different from the idea of a secularism and as enunciated or practiced in the Western democracies. We do not have a concept, what you call as a classically separation of the state and separation of religion. Like in the American Constitution, it is completely a separation of the state and religion. And also, a religion cannot interfere, neither state can interfere in religion in the United States. In a country like France, there is a separation of religion, but the state can interfere in religion, but religion cannot interfere in the state. In India, it is a kind of an equal distance from all religions. An equal distance from all religions, and then our narrative of a cultural history, our narrative of a civilizational understanding of our history and society has not been influenced and conditioned by any majoritarian narrative of there has been dominances. Dominance is always a dominance, and resistance is part of a political discourse and a dialogue. There has been a dominance, but it has not been the single most narrative of our understanding of our culture and identity. This plurality has continued to influence in the drafting of the Constitution and in defining the concept of a secularism as well in India. So we now, today, we feel this idea of a secularism is under threat. What we historically believe who we are as a society and a multicultural and multi-ethnic and a plural and a secular. And this secularism is about also an idea of not simply separation, but a mutual respect for all religions. And there is another important thing I want to share in this conversation is that when religions or other religions are under attack, if Islam or Christianity of a non-Hindu varieties but I think the responsibility of defending a democracy or defending secularism does not lie only with the Muslim. Does not lie only with the Christians or with the non-Hindu communities, because it is not the idea of a democracy or the protection of a minority alone. It is also the protection of the idea of a secularism and the idea of democracy. So therefore, it is a national project for everybody in the country to fight back and to fight back to this kind of development that has happened in the last 20 years. And I must say with all confidence is that, what has made change to the present definition of the rise of the right-wing radicalism is that, besides this, I see it as a global phenomenon, but also in India, that what you call the numerical understanding of a kind of a vote bank politics, electoral democracy, by mobilizing by identity of a Hindu identity. And then there is also resistance to this kind of mobilization that is taking place. And in a sense is that we look at it as a transitory space. And because we have had one experience of the rise and execution of a very authoritarian politics by the middle of 1970s, and authoritarian and centralized rise of the politics in 1970s. But today in India too, we see this kind of the rise of the right-wing radicalism will in fact be resisted by the multiplicity of the India's federal polity and the multiplicity of Indian culture and of the society, because the very diversity itself, it must protect. Each of us must protect not only our own identity, but in the process, we contribute to the protection of the collective identity of this nation. So we coming closer to the conversation is that in electoral, we are looking at the prospect of the elections in 2024, and if the present party, and if it returns to power, certainly it's not going to come back to power with the same majority number of seats and votes. And so even by a reduction in number of seats by about 10 to 20%, it means about they don't have an absolute majority. Or even just right at the point of having a majority and not having an absolute majority, and then little short of majority makes all the difference in a plural, in a very diverse country. And we are talking about politics that can happen by sharing of the seats and votes. And by this emphasis, many things can just be seen as a reversal in the next few years. And also, this reversal doesn't happen in any country. Any country, all of a sudden, turn around. A country is marching in one direction. Turnaround doesn't happen immediately, but certainly inclinations and tendencies and the axis shift is already taking place in India. I am quite convinced and that India would turn back in a way that we are walking for the last 20 years. We'll turn back and then walk further. And this turning around is not walking back. But these are contradictions, conflicts, which we see it as a part of a creative conflict in our political society. And Indian democracy, the ethos of multiculturalism, and the idea of a secularism, then the plurality will bring this back to the path that was envisaged and that has always been the path of India as a country and as a civilization. I want to thank you all for sharing this conversation.
We have some time for questions. Of course, at the end of the forum, there is pizza out there for you to grab, okay? So just to let you know. So we start with questions, first with the students, and then we'll expand the field. Any questions at this point from students?
If you have a question, I'll bring the microphone to you.
Thank you so much. I know you touched on it already, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your kind of predictions or visions for the upcoming election.
Okay. See, in terms of electoral perception, I worked in the elections and I've been an election observer, and I write a column for Indian newspaper from being here in the United States too. And so I can say it confidently that the present party and government and the present party in power in the government of India is not going to come back with the same number of seats. That's something very, very confidently I can say that. And then there are things that they are talking, and there's a lot of questions being raised from different parts of the country. And even today, in the next week or so, there's kind of assembly elections in 5 states that the country is going to go into the elections, and they are not certain even in about 5 they would come back in 3. And so there's a strong currents of resistance to the thing. So numerically, in terms of the vote share and the number of seats, is that like in the higher number of seats that is anticipated for this government is that, like, they're looking at 225 out of 540, 42, 43. So that means about, like, they are not nearing the majority number of seats, actually. So this would have tremendous impact on the journey of this party and its ideological momentum. And, like, they are outside the momentum now. But all political parties look like they are outside the momentum near the elections. That's a very kind of a global phenomenon, global feature. But I have reasons to believe that they would not come back with the same number of absolute majorities. Cannot be predicted to them.
Any follow-up to this? Any follow-up?
No.
Okay. So,
Thank you for your time today. You mentioned corruption in politics. Do you have any techniques or advice of how we can take corruption out of politics and move forward together?
It's quite right, actually. Like, this in India, politics and corruption and thing is we have not had a kind of a strong institutional devices about, because what I mean by the corruption happens within the institution is one thing, but the excesses committed by individuals and for abusing the office and misuse of power, and then including the corruption, and we have not really had a huge success in what you call it's all converts into electoral debate. It's a very unfortunate thing about corruption. Corruption, we talk about it in electoral politics, but actually it should be debated within the institution, and reprimand and punishment has to be established within the legal and the political system. So there is a gap in that sense. I want to acknowledge that gap in India too. But I want also to say, but by saying this, I don't mean to say that in India is an exception. This is a global phenomenon. This is a global phenomenon. In fact, works like Transparency International and all these organizations, their data and revelations always say this is a global phenomenon. And in something else is the politicians in India mostly see this as when the cases of proven and demonstrated, and the punishment has never been a recovery of the property or money, actually. And unlike the banks do that, the banks do it to us, actually. If you don't pay your loan back and they take they confiscate your property, you have to put your property in stake. But it is not, that particular kind of development in law and anti-corruption laws has not evolved. It has been purely in terms of, we are going through a pace where there's a trial and observation pace. And I must say that India is a state of we know there are corruptions happen, there's trials are underway, but we want to know what has happened after the trial. We are at that state of our transparency.
Thank you for your talk today. That was wonderful. My question is going back to identity and the securitization of identity. In India, what does economic class struggle play into that securitization of identity?
Sure. I think in India now the economic class is that this notion of class I must be very clear about saying this. In the middle class, I want to kind of differentiate the role of middle class in this context, actually. The Aristotelian concept of the golden mean has worked in different ways in different countries, actually. But this, the very Platonic and Aristotelian conception of this golden mean has been conceived primarily as a kind of to stabilize in things. But more often, the middle classes in India, what happens is that it's a kind of a ladder. It's a ladder. They want to be part of the sharing the riches, the dividends of the globalization, and the rise of the technocratic and the rise of the technology and the professional classes they become part of. So there is a stagnation too in political process because of this role of thing. Then the surge and like the quest for change and resistance always is happening at the bottom. But in the bottom, what happens is that the social divisions in the bottom is that you also have the upper class and upper caste in the bottom of the system, in the rural areas. And they think about they are not part of the larger discourse happening in India, but they are indirectly connected to the control and resistance happening at the two different levels. So that's why I always say, India is not one India anytime. There are many Indias. There is an urban India and a rural India is one thing. And then you have what you call the class struggle. And then I must say this reference to you, the reason that the communist parties in India have ruled in two different states for a long time, but they have not been able to absolutely consolidate the power because they did not see the caste as a class in India. The caste itself is a class in India. This is one other important factor. And then subsequently, in the class notion is that the marginalized, I would rather see people who are oppressed and the marginalized and the indigenous people and people who are discriminated in our society, they are, wherever they find themselves, they are fighting for change. And there's a word shared by a very eminent writer by Naipaul, and India is a land where there's 1 million mutinies happen every day. So that resistance, Amartya Sen's argumentative Indian or Naipaul's million mutinies are absolutely true about the nature of Indian society. It's very active, very turbulent, very seismic. It constantly that working. I think marginalized people and throughout the country are fighting at the bottom. I mean, when I say at the bottom, anyone who's fighting at the bottom, certainly they are oppressed. They're talking about injustice. They're talking about issues of distributional and social and economic and political justice. And then my surprise is that why is it that the large constituency of technocratic and professional and middle classes are silent? And there is only a small constituency of that is looking into this shifts and challenges and changes are happening in the Indian politics. So I think always that constituency is a number that influences the outcome. So therefore, I do not have larger grievances why they are not, but I want to see what even among them do for the change.
By the way, these are very good questions we have been asking.
Yeah, so a lot of the democratic backsliding in India is kind of attributed to the coalition government that formed in 2014 with the BJP. I think according to the Economist Democracy Index, India went from 27th in 2014 to I think 46th today, so that's quite a large jump. But if I'm understanding you correctly, that you expect that the BJP will lose seats in the upcoming election, yes?
They will not come back with the strength and sound,
yeah.
And they would be much decline in their power profile, in their articulation of the Hindutva, and they have to go for a moderation of their own ideological moderation will happen.
So what do you think is going to be the implication for democracy in India? Do you think that the trend of democratic backsliding in India will continue or will be reversed or kind of stay stable?
That's a good question. There's a very good implication in this question. Like what happens in India is that I always want to there's a very well-established saying, but a good democracy is judged not by the party that is in power, but is judged by the parties in opposition. It's absolutely true. I want to share this with all this very humility. The role of opposition is very important, very creative, very constructive. And India had lost the reasons among three most important reasons why the right-wing radicalism of BJP has come into power is also the fact that the Congress has declined, has moved away from its historical role and vision and leadership. And suddenly there's a vacuum in the state, in the party's leadership. Leadership is also very, very important in politics. And they always say, we all have good ideas, but we need a carrier. We need a vision, a man or woman leader who can carry this vision, articulate this vision. So, leaders have made difference like that. And certainly, we are in short of leaders in India, in their position, particularly. That's why, everybody celebrates Mr. Modi as a leader. But, sometimes about, when you see a leader, we always say, a very strong, and then very affirmative and very articulative, but we are yet to determine, are these the only qualities to be a leader? We don't ask a question about what are the policies and what are the principles and what is your background and what do you have for this country. We don't ask this thing. We see about an articulation. And there's a kind of a strong leadership, a kind of in quantified way we look at leadership as a strength. But I think there has to be a redefinition of a leadership in terms of qualitatively assessment of a leader. It takes time because leaders have to come from the ground. It takes a long time. So in India, the Congress party failed to cultivate a leader from within for a long time. And also country is also looking at in a very more democratic way, should the leader come from one family or the same family? And what about why other leaders are not coming from other parties and families? So this kind of a dilemma also has created a vacuum for us.
Any other questions from students? Yes, go ahead.
All right. I'm coming to you.
Yeah, the microphone.
Sorry. So I know that the Biden administration mentioned that they wanted to have closer economic ties with India, but also through the BRICS and other alliances, Russia and China are moving closer to India too, with alliances. I was just wondering how you think those alliances are going to impact India's democracy and also its economically.
Okay. I can give a very diplomatic answer or a political answer. And my diplomatic answer is that irrespective of the leadership transition between any two countries, that the countries and the leadership focus on stabilizing the ties. So that way Biden and Mr. Modi look at the relationship between them. But if you want me to answer in a political way, and Modi has lost a friend in the United States. And in a way, as the former leadership was seen to be a kind of more closer in ties, but that was reflective of the global trend. And not only of the United States, not only of India, but there's a kind of a right-wing radicalism in the United States and in Europe and different parts of Europe. So they're kind of an ideological affinity doesn't exist in the present ties and communication between India and the United States, but there is a political and diplomatic and strategic affirmations are there.
All right, we'll open it up to anybody now for questions.
Any questions from the online?
Not right now, but I'll keep an eye out.
There's a question, yeah.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. I have a question about the role of education. If you look at US, you see a strong correlation between people's education, higher education specifically, and liberal attitudes. Do you see that in India? Because anecdotes tell me that if you just look at the Indian diaspora in the US, the rich diaspora with high education are quite supportive of the radical right-wing ideology. So do you think the education failed us in some way?
Yes, in fact, interestingly about politics and education. See, as long as you see education as a path to empowerment, your ideological orientation is different. When then you translate education as a power, knowledge as power, then you misuse that thing. That is happening in the most educated communities, and even in India, in the United States, you find about. So when you begin to see that, it's a path to empowerment, is you're talking about justice and your needs and this thing. When you think that is a power, then it translates in a different way. That is how, it's one of the big surprises even for us is that why the right-wing radicalism in India gets affirmative support in the United States and in the non-resident Indians or the American Indians is also a surprise. But I can understand from that because they begin to see that they don't see the diversity of India when they come out of the country. They see that what in the seat of power and in terms of identity of a visibility for India. They take pride at some of the successes and activities and landing in the moon with on the side and then doing the technological things. But they do not go often into the social struggles and the denial of rights and the divisive politics that we are going through in India. That's why I always say about when we are seeing from far, and it is good to not to see just the dot, and it is good to see there is a big black hole and behind this. And so that is how I find about in India too. There's a large section of the what I mentioned to another question is that the professional middle classes and technocrats and then people in higher professions and things, they see this as a political modernization that India is going through in terms of technology, in terms of development and per capita, and we are competing with, we could be about in third largest economy, but we are not asking question, if you are a third largest economy, how is it going to be in terms of distributing the gains of the status of third largest economy? We see it in terms of the shares and we see it in terms of the investments, and I think the greater democratization and struggles happening at the ground. So there is a gap in this perception.
I have a related follow-up question because it's the technocrats mainly who are the recipients of the benefits of globalization in India, and that's the most visible part. So do you think our technocratic education system, devoid of social sciences and humanities, is the root of this problem?
I mean, I do have a concern about how we study science in India. And we study science in an exclusion, actually. So in fact, I'm in great appreciation of the US curriculum, United States curriculum, that students going to medical schools and the engineering schools not only have an opportunity, but they choose consciously to go and study philosophy, study history, and which I greatly appreciate. And some of our premier technological institutions like Indian Institute of Technology in India is that, and you have to go search for our humanities and social science departments. And I have a complaint. I've gone there to teach I'm in the PhD committees there, and I always question that, why is it so difficult to find humanities in your technological space? So it's a very great saying that the scientists also should be educated about humanities. I am a very strong faith in things. This is one of the reasons about indifference to politics. Indifference to politics is and Indian society at large has another problem is that we all want our children to be a kind of a scientist and doctors and technocrats, and we don't want them to be lawyers and philosophers and teachers, actually. So,
artists.
Or artists. So this is a kind of a familial and societal prejudice that results in demarcation of things. Then the large multitude of people, and they are the people who are in politics. So we see them from outside and for a very long time, but they are making us outsiders in that, and that I am happy about it. And people who are struggling for justice, people who are in quest for justice, they are making the technocrats and the middle classes and the stagnation. They are exposing the stagnation in our political understanding of the realities.
The liberal democracy and liberal education, they go hand in hand. They go together.
Yeah.
So, other questions?
We are just about out of time. Any closing remarks from either of our guests today?
I would like to make perhaps a comment or two.
Sure.
India gained its independence from the Brits, from British colonial exploitation, after suffering for centuries. India was a wrecked country economically, every way, what the Brits did there. And that's why there's a saying globally about the Brits. Why is it that the sun never set on the British Empire? Because God didn't trust the Brits in the dark. That's why. Wherever the Brits went, they have created problems, centuries old, and you can see the seed of that right now in all the conflicts happening around the world. And India is no exception. That partition that Professor Manivandan mentioned, partition of India, partition of India into India and Pakistan, and that Hindu-Muslim divide. Brits have brought this idea of what they call divide and rule. As a result, the division got more pronounced than it ever was. India has been more of an inclusive and a pluralistic democracy, of course, since its independence, but traditionally it has that tradition of inclusivity and pluralism, and that got took a blow, and then India is trying to get back to it. But because of India's electoral democracy, in spite of India's paradoxes and disparities and contradictions, still it's a relatively peaceful society, and it has the highest number of political representation of marginalized group than any other democracies or countries in the world, And that has to do with its inclusive politics too. India has had, women presidents, powerful women prime ministers, and then of course, prime ministers from most other religions that's in India, Sikhs, Muslims, and Hindus. And right now, by the way, do you know that India's president is a tribal woman, and she's the president of India. And that's unthinkable in most other democracies, in fact, any other democracies, So all these, so India has that side, but also the other side of disparity, poverty, and exploitation, and especially corruption, all of that. So it's a dynamic tension, and the question is, where does it go from here? Yes. So that's the thing, we wanted to hear from our honored guest, and we got a glimpse of that here. So do you like to have a comment? Closing comment?
Yeah, I think I'm quite happy in sharing these conversations, and then really excellent questions, and then I'd be very happy if you want to keep this dialogue going, and then I have the contacts and you can write to us, and then I will also be staying at front because as I mentioned in the beginning of this conversation, when I go back to India, I'm doing this long march to bring awareness about the impact on the right-wing radicalism and the extremes and political ideology, but in a non-partisan way, not taking one party or the other. But I find that being in academics, it's also very important for us to be kind of going to the people, listening to them and sharing the space and coming back to the classes and going back to the society. It's a kind of a mutual function for us. So thank you for this.
So with that, we'd like to give our thanks to our honored guest. Nick, would you like to have any comment?
Only that you beat me to it. Thank you so much for joining us. Please join me in welcoming our guests. And just so you all know, grab some pizza on your way out. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.